What can devastate an area nearly 3 times the size of New York City and leave almost no trace behind? On the morning of June 30th, 1908, something entered the sky over one of the most remote regions of Siberia. People saw a flash of light brighter than the morning sun. They felt sudden heat on their skin. Then came a blast so violent it threw people to the ground and flattened trees for miles in every direction. The scale was almost impossible to understand. Hundreds of square miles of forest were crushed. The shock was felt far beyond the wilderness. Windows shattered in distant settlements. Instruments recorded disturbances across the region. And yet, when the noise faded, there was no crater, no giant fragment, no obvious object buried in the ground. Something had exploded over Siberia, but the thing that caused it seemed to have vanished. To the people who witnessed it, Tunguska was not a scientific mystery. It was a light in the sky, a wave of heat, a sound like thunder, and then a forest that no longer stood where it had stood before. Some described a fireball crossing the heavens. Others said the light was almost unbearable. Then the explosion arrived, rolling across the land with enough force to knock people down, damage homes, and send animals fleeing in terror. And yet, they were lucky. If the same blast had happened over London, New York, Paris, or Moscow, it would have become one of the defining disasters of the 20th century. There would have been ruins, photographs, official investigations, and a death toll impossible to ignore. But Tunguska happened over forest, marshland, rivers, and scattered settlements. It happened in a place so remote that the land could be devastated before the world truly understood there had been a catastrophe. That remoteness changed everything. Russia was still under Tsar Nicholas II. Within a few years, the country would be consumed by war, revolution, and civil conflict. No major expedition reached the center of the blast while the evidence was fresh. No team stood in the wreckage in the days after the explosion. For years, Tunguska existed mostly as testimony. People had seen the sky burn, heard the blast, and felt the force, but the center of the event remained distant, silent, and almost untouched. Then came Leonid Kulik. Kulik was a Russian mineralogist, and he believed the answer was waiting somewhere in the Siberian wilderness. If something from space had caused the explosion, then the ground should still hold proof. A crater, a meteorite, a buried mass. Some physical remnant of whatever had fallen from the sky. But reaching Tunguska was its own ordeal. The terrain was difficult, the region was isolated, and nearly 20 years had passed since the morning of the blast. When Kulik finally arrived in 1927, he was not entering a fresh disaster scene. He was walking into a mystery that time had already begun to erase. What he found was not the simple answer he expected. It was stranger. The forest had not merely burned. It had been knocked flat. Trees lay across the ground in a vast pattern, pointing away from a central area, as if an invisible force had swept outward over the land. But near the center, some trees were still standing. Their branches were gone. Their bark had been stripped away. They looked like poles left behind in a dead landscape. Kulik had gone to Siberia looking for the body of the crime. But Tunguska refused to give him one. There was destruction everywhere, but no impact crater. There was a blast zone, but no buried object large enough to explain it. The evidence pointed to something enormous, but the object itself was missing. That absence opened the door to almost every theory imaginable. Some argued it had been a comet, fragile enough to disintegrate before reaching the ground. Others believed it was a meteor. Some suggested an explosion from beneath the earth. And as the story spread, stranger claims followed. Tunguska had everything a mystery needed: a remote location, few witnesses, delayed investigation, massive destruction, and no obvious object left behind. But the forest kept pointing toward the sky. The radial pattern of fallen trees, the stripped trunks near the center, and the missing crater all suggested that the main force had not erupted from the ground. It had come from above it. And over time, scientists began to understand a possibility that seemed strange at first. Whatever destroyed Tunguska did not need to hit the Earth to devastate it. A body from space can carry enormous energy before it ever reaches the surface. If an object tens of meters wide enters the atmosphere at cosmic speed, the air in front of it compresses violently. The object heats, fractures, and begins to break apart. If enough energy is released at once, the explosion happens in the air. That is the leading explanation for Tunguska. The object likely entered Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed, plunged toward Siberia, and then broke apart several miles above the forest. It did not strike the ground intact. It exploded before impact. The sky became the impact site. That is why no ordinary crater was found. That is why no giant meteorite was waiting in the ground. Much of the object was destroyed in the atmosphere, but its energy did not disappear. It moved into the air, and the air carried the violence downward. The shock wave slammed into the forest with enough force to flatten roughly 830 square miles of trees. Heat scorched parts of the landscape. Pressure spread outward across the wilderness. To anyone below, it would not have mattered that the object never touched the ground. The destruction was real. But this is where Tunguska becomes even more unsettling. For decades, the mystery was that the object disappeared. But the more scientists understood, the clearer something else became. That disappearance may have prevented something worse. If the object had been stronger, denser, larger, or had entered at a different angle, more of it might have survived the atmosphere. Instead of releasing most of its energy above the forest, it could have reached the surface. And a direct impact is not just an explosion in the air. It is the Earth itself being struck at cosmic speed. In that version of Tunguska, the story might not have ended with a flattened forest and a missing crater. It could have ended with a permanent scar in the ground, rock vaporized, debris thrown outward, seismic shaking, thermal radiation, and destruction concentrated into the surface itself. The airburst was catastrophic, but a true ground impact could have been worse. That is why Tunguska was lucky. Not harmless, not safe. Lucky. It happened over one of the emptiest places it could have happened. It happened above forest, rivers, marshland, and scattered settlements instead of a major city. It happened in a place where a catastrophe could become a mystery instead of a mass grave. And that is the part that remains difficult to ignore. The most frightening thing about Tunguska is not simply that something came from space. It is that nothing about Earth makes that impossible again. The atmosphere protected the ground from a direct impact that morning, but it did not stop the destruction. It transformed the object into an explosion above the forest. It erased much of the evidence before scientists could study it. And for nearly 20 years, the world was left trying to understand how so much land could be devastated by something that seemed to leave no body behind. Objects still cross Earth's orbit. Most are small. Most burn away. Many are tracked long before they matter. But not everything that comes from space announces itself early. Not everything arrives with enough warning to change what lies beneath it. In 1908, something entered the atmosphere over Siberia and released enough energy to flatten a forest nearly 3 times the size of New York City. It left no crater. It left no giant fragment. It left behind witnesses, damage, and a warning written across the trees. Sometimes the danger is not the object that reaches the ground. Sometimes it is the one that disappears above it.